Okay, I've just spotted another little example that might be interesting to look at. So I've just done a rigid body fill on the shoulder towards the last part of the shoulder. So if you look here, you can see I've filled the gap in because that primary marker has got the nodules on it. But I noticed that there's a pink marker, an unlabeled marker that appears during that gap. Now, again, there's two things I can do here. If I spot that, I can undo it and maybe look at that one to see how many frames there are. And it might be that I want to label that to say that it's the shoulder, because it clearly is where the shoulder should be. But if I look back at that, if I go and redo that, the difference is negligible, the position, yeah? If it was a really tricky spot where I had very little data and it was all noisy, any frame that I can get of the original marker as an unlabeled one and label it is worthwhile doing. But in a situation like this, I'd leave it. It's more complicated to go away and try and fix that. If you notice there, it pops back in almost exactly the same place it should be. So that tells me that my rigid fill worked. The unlabeled marker was there and the rigid fills put that marker back in nearly exactly the same place as it should be. So therefore, if it looks right, it is right. Back to that good old adage, and I don't have to worry about filling that gap in again. So I just thought I'd point that out, because again, if you spot that, there's a question from Philip, as long as you don't mind me pointing it out, Philip. Can you delete some part of the tracking if I spot a problem and try to recreate it by myself? Okay. The only time you delete some part of the data is if it's causing errors. If you've got a noisy marker that you need to get rid of, like I was showing with the Y key, yeah, to cut the keys out, or the E key to cut keys from a marker. There's not much point in deleting the data yourself and putting it back, because it will just go back in that same place. Yeah. The best problems you are going to find are going to be the ones. When you say that's what happened to me, can you explain a little more? Yeah, okay. So if it's noisy markers, then yes, I'd get rid of them, because they're going to affect that rigid body fill. So when you get those keys, like I said, you've got, so for instance, if you notice a wobbly key on, say, this one in a selection set, and don't forget, you can cycle between them using the R and the T key. It cycles backwards and forwards through that selection and spot some noisy data on something. Yeah, then you can cut the keys for that primary marker. So if I did it here, notice there's a, let's have a look at that frame. If I've got this marker selected as primary, I've got this time range selected, and I hit the Y key, it cuts those keys and puts it back. Obviously, bad example because there was no wobble there, but that's the way to fix noisy markers. Whilst you have a selection of markers, the rigid body selection there, narrow down the frames that are problematic, that wobble and are noisy, and then highlight that marker that's wobbling as the primary and use Y key to cut its keys and fill it back in. You could do it the long-winded way. You could highlight that marker, select it on its own, press the E key to cut its keys, then select the markers again and do a rigid fill. But that's why we've set up this special Y hotkey, is you can do it all in one operation. You can spot the frames that are bad, highlight the primary marker, select the range of time, hit the Y key, and it's fixed. Yeah. So I'm just going to carry on now. I should have one last gap to do on my shoulders, and then I should have done one of the shoulders completely. And it's really satisfying when you get to that this point now where you've got nothing in the gap list for your selection, which means if I hit the Q key, you get no gaps found at the bottom, and you've done it. So what I decided to start doing was starting on the torso. It's a good way of working, and then moving outwards, because then you're fixing any kind of shared markers. So now I know that my shoulder's fixed and my torso all the way out. And now I can start looking at the other parts. All right, earlier on, I did some fixing on the upper arm because it solved another problem I was having. It allowed me to stabilize some data. But now I know I can just work down section by section along that arm and come across the problems as I'm going to see them. Now, before we get towards a point where it's a bit late to kind of demonstrate anything, I just want to jump into the section in the handout which covers this leg at the bottom. Yeah. So earlier on, I looked at the legs to see if there was any gaps. And again, just to remind you, I can select the toes, hit the X on the gap lister to clear the selection, and then the little arrow to populate it. And I'll see that there's no gaps. The next part of the foot, same again, X to clear, arrow to populate, no gaps. So I know the feet are both clear. I can just select all of that one and look, and there's no gaps in it. I could have done it one at a time, but again, I can investigate. Just do that and look at the gap list for it. So I can see on our leg, we've got this. And in the PDF, it's in just after cleaning the pelvis, we clean the feet and we find that there's no gaps on them. And then we start looking at the leg. So this is a specific problem we've got on this one, and it's why I use this clip particularly. So let's get it into some context. I'm going to zoom all the way back to frame 1. I'm going to select the rigid body for the lower leg, which is the 2 knee markers, the back of the leg marker or the shin marker if you want, even though we put it on the calf muscle, and the ankle. Let's clear that gap list and populate it with those ones. So now we can see that we've got some marks, some gaps. And you can see there's quite a big one. 1,755 frames for this left knee inner marker. So let's go through in an orderly way and let's at least get all of these gaps cleaned up using the same old technique: F to frame, X to track, Q to find my first gap. So let's have a look at that. So this one, 155 frames, and let's look at what happens in that. Legs are bent, marker gets squashed in between the thigh and the calf muscle, but it's good before and it's good afterwards. So I hit the W key and it's cleaned. Now see there's a little wobble there on our primary marker. So let's zoom in on that. And that's probably where it was getting squashed. So you can see this little blip in there. So again, we could do that. We could kind of just go onto that frame range like that and then hit the Y key. Now that wobble's gone. That's how we fix noisy data. Using the rest of the rigid body, if it's all wobbling, we're going to get wobble back in it. But that's a quick example of how to fix it. Yeah. So let's just keep going through and looking at the rest of the gaps on that lower leg. So here we are. We're at the point now where we have an issue. So as we can see here, the knees come together very closely. And you can see they sort of collide. The leg rubs, the left leg rubs across the right leg, and you'll see it. The marker gets stuck. And if we look, if we try and look sort of parallel like that, you can see it stretches. So the Velcro gets stuck on the material, pulls to a point where it can't pull anymore, comes detached, sticks to the other leg, and now we have a gap. The labeler is too much of an error. And let's have a look here. I've got that marker selected and there's another frame here. Why is there another frame? So what happens there is the leg gets really close and the labeler goes, oh, I know where it is. It's there, but it's not because it's stuck to the other leg. Look at that jump. There's a big jump there. So let's have a look to see what I do if I do a rigid body fill. So if I do W now, look what happens. That marker drifts over because it had a frame reference. It thinks that's still the rigid body definition. It thinks, oh, I'm okay, I can use that, and just fills that gap because it says it's rigid. But what it does is it drifts. It drifts over to that leg and it looks all wrong. So I'm going to undo that. So how do we stop something like that? Again, it's a labeling issue. It labeled that one frame as the left knee inner marker. Now there's nothing to relabel it as. It's stuck to another leg. It's not a real marker position. So what would we do in that instance? Well, what we do is we would select that frame using the ranges. So I'm going to use the in and out points, which is comma and full stop, or the angle brackets to select that one frame, and then hit the E key. Cut that key out. Oops. Big mistake. I did it for all the markers, making sure I've just got that marker selected. Just the one marker, and I'll press the E key to cut the keys. So now there's not a mislabeled frame. It's still, see the blip is still there in that leg because I haven't resolved. Yeah? But I've got rid of that incorrect frame that was labeled. So let's go back. Before that all happens, select those markers again that make up that lower leg, hit Q, and now you can see the gap's updated. There was a blip frame in the middle, but now our gap's become longer. So let's have a look at that. Let's zoom right out on the graph and see what goes on. And oh, look, there's some more frames over here. So let's investigate those because they could cause a similar error. So I'm going to go forwards. This is a great example of how we use the graph to investigate stuff. Because watch what happens. If I do a rigid body fill now, it's all over the shop. Yeah. It drifts out of shape. It's going completely wrong. And that is because we've got these rogue frames over here. So let's go and check them. Let's move our time slider. See, it jumps over here for some reason. Now, what could be causing that? It's the sword. Jumps to the position of the sword. And then in another frame, it blips back again. So because we have that selected and we've told it it's a rigid body, it's using that shape, which causes the errors in the film. So we've got to fix these frames. Now, as we can see, these belong to the sword. They are M1 on the sword, marker 1 on the sword. So we need to fix that as a labeling thing. So we need to be able to label it as a completely different subject. So we've got Faisal here, and we've got wooden sword. So we need to swap those labels between subjects. So how do we do that? Let's do that now as an example, and then I can put this video up for you as reference. So let's start off by selecting I've just lost the frame with the selection on, so I'm just going to go back to a point where I can see all of those markers and select them. Hit Q again to frame that gap. If you get lost and you know what you did before, that's all I did. I scrubbed before where there was missing markers, selected them all, and hit the Q key to get back to where I was. Yeah. So let's have a look at those frames. So I'm going to scroll carefully with the scroll wheel, and we can see that pop on that frame. So the frame before, not there. So it's a one frame blip. So on that frame, I'm going to select that time using in and out points. And now I'm just working on one marker. So I'm just going to make sure that that marker is selected. And I'm going to go to labeling. And what I'm going to do is I'm now in, I don't want to label it as Faisal because this marker doesn't belong to Faisal. It belongs to the sword as M1. So the subject I'm labeling, I'll go into the drop-down menu and the sword. And as we can see, M1 is red, which means it's missing at this frame, but we know it's that. So again, we've got backwards and forwards in selected and ranges. The marker's selected in there, and I'll just click on M1. And it's relabeled it. And I know that there's another blip coming up. There we go. There it is. I just found it. difficult to find because it's a one frame blip again, where it thinks it's the knee. So I select that one, mark the in and the out point for it, and then click on M1 in the sword. So now we don't have those blips, but we still have a problem on our knee. So again, go back to the knee. Let's go back to the knee where we can select all the markers and that lower leg, hit Q, and now we're back. And if we go into our marker editing window, we can now see that we've only got, let's just clear that, populate it again. We've now got one big gap that lasts all the way through from where the marker becomes detached right to the end of the take. So what we think now is, oh, we can just do a rigid fill on that. I'll hit W. Now watch that marker. It drifts about all over the shop, yeah? Because there is no frames at the end to tell it what that rigid body is. So it's guessed, and it's got it horribly wrong. That's moving about all over the shop, yeah? This is a real specific instance here, and this is like quite unique to this clip, but it just kind of shows you that importance of knowing the tools around you. So for this one, we can't use a rigid fill. One of those rare occasions where a rigid body fill will not work because there's no keyframes at the end of the clip to tell us where it is before and after. So the rigid fill won't work. So how do we fill in that error? And this is where the PDF tells you about a special kind of solve, a fill called a constraint fill. So we're going to use the skeleton to fix this. But if we look, we can see that there was problems where we had it before because it had those mislabels and this drifting marker as it becomes unstuck. So what we need to do to know that the skeleton is stable enough, we solve solving. So we solve the whole take, which fixes the leg without those blip frames and will give us a smooth solve. There's enough markers around that knee to give us a decent fill, to give us a decent solve. So I can just double check that. I've still got the range of time selected in there from that gap that I found. So let's just look. As that knee comes together, the marker comes off, but our solve is still stable because it's got enough there to tell it it is. And we've got all of that missing. Yet the leg looks fine because the other markers are able to do that solve for us. So as a matter of course, we could leave it like that. We know the skeleton is right, and that's what we're going to export. So we could just leave it at that skeleton being okay and export it. But for the sake of completionism, let's fill that gap using a special type of fill. So I'm going to select that gap, that marker. I need to be before the gap to do that. So I'm going to select that knee marker. Now I've still got this range of time selected. If you lose the selection, just go backwards and hit Q, and it will select that whole range of time for you, and that knee marker is still selected. Yeah, you could do it by eye, you could drag a marquee, you could use it in and out points. Doesn't matter how you select the time as long as you've got that right range selected. So now I'm going to go to marker editing, and I'm going to bring back up the editing tools in my menu, and I'm looking for a special operation that we use called fill using constraints. Now, to put some context in, if I use a view filters, zoom views getting in the way of everything, I want to be able to see these constraints. So I'm going to go to my view menu and I'm going to bring in the solving constraints and see. Now, if you look carefully, there's a little square that's appeared, which is the constraint. So this is where the skeleton thinks the marker should be. And I can use that position to put the marker data back in. So if we set the options up properly, I don't want it for the current frame. I want it for the selected ranges. And I don't want to use the labeling skeleton. I want to use the solving constraint. And then I can click that button. Fill using constraints. And now it's put the marker back in based on where the skeleton thinks that marker should be. So this highlights how we can use the skeleton to fix marker problems as well. There's a range of tools at our disposal, and it is all dependent on the circumstances of that marker and what happens and what makes the gap appear. You'll use this every now and then. It's rare that this occurrence happens. It usually happens when you get a gap that runs right towards the end of the take, where there's not enough information afterwards. It doesn't exist because we stopped recording to give it that rigid body definition. Yeah, and where there's significant movement in space, etc. A number of criteria, but it's just important to see that relationship between markers and skeleton on this. And again, I'll use the recording of this to highlight this example as well, to put up as a specific example as reference for you for next week. But this covers that section in the PDF as well now, how we used a constraint to fill a marker in because rigid fill wouldn't work. One of those rare occurrences. So now, if I go back, I think, right, well, where was I? I was cleaning up. I need to move the participant list again so I can see what I'm doing. I'm just going to scrub back to frame 1 and just select all of those markers in that leg. Turn the editing tools off. Populate that list, and now I can see there's no gaps. Even if I select all of those markers for the knees down and the feet, and then populate that gap list, there are no gaps on that. All of my lower legs are fixed. And if I look at my skeleton, my pelvis, update that list, there are no gaps. But if I select these 2 thigh markers, there are some gaps. Now, again, the thigh markers are a bit of an exception, as it says in the handout, because they are probably the least rigid markers on the whole body, because they're attached to large muscles on the upper leg that, unless those muscles are tense, there's no rigid relationship with the knees, or there's very little rigid relationship with those knees. So how would we fill the gaps in on those? Well, the easiest way is, again, to use constraint fills. The skeleton knows where they should be. They're moving about lots. And again, they contribute very little to the solve. So what we can do, special occasion now, is go to editing tools. We're going to fill using constraints, solving constraints. And I'm going to say all time instead of selected ranges, because I want to get all of these gaps for all of these markers. And then I'm going to hit fill using constraints. There's no gaps on those anymore, and we know they're filled in, and we can kind of move on. Yeah? So at this point in time, I know I have now filled all of the gaps from the pelvis down on those legs. Satisfying feeling. And I've also done the torso. And I've also done those 2 front shoulder, those shoulder markers as well. So now I've got a good core. If I look at the left shoulder, there are still some markers in there that I need to go and clean up. So that might be the next thing that I do. I could work outwards and go all the way down the right arm, or I could start working out from the torso. So I know I've got the head, torso, pelvis and legs all fixed, and the right shoulder. So I think what I'm going to probably do is work outwards from the core and do that left shoulder again. Up to you. I don't mind how you work, but all I need to know in your report when you're doing all that is to tell me about it. Yeah. But this exercise, just for your references to get your head around that kind of workflow process, is do it as you see fit, but try and keep your kind of self-organized and working in some kind of methodical fashion. Yeah.